Hello everybody, my name is Dylan Pines with Musician on a Mission, and I'm here today to answer the age-old question, what the hell is mastering? I know for so many years I had absolutely no idea. To me, they were basically just some wizard in a studio waving a magic wand and just saying, voila, be professional. And then it was. Just had no idea. And after many, many years of mixing and producing and working with mastering engineers, I've finally come to terms with exactly what a mastering engineer does, exactly what the mastering process is all about. So that's what this video is going to be covering. If you have any confusion over what the mastering process actually is, like what it does, what the function of it is, well, this is the video for you. Just stay tuned. By the end, you're going to feel much, much better. So let's start off by talking about the most common confusion with mastering. And that's just this common adage that you hear all the time that mastering, quote, makes it louder, right? I'm sure you've heard that from all of your mixing friends, maybe your producer, maybe a professor. And it's probably confusing to you because, like me, you just think, okay, well, can't I just go turn the volume knob up? Can I turn the fader up and then it's louder? It's all good. That's all they're doing, right? So either you get really confident and you try to go and just turn up the volume yourself, or you end up being like me whenever I was getting started. I had just a pathological fear of ever touching the volume fader on the stereo output. Like my mix bus, if I ever touched it, I would just instantly go back and try to fix it. It terrified me because I had no idea if that was like adding extra grime or if that was adding some sort of processing that was like only meant for these mastering wizards or anything like that. And the truth is, neither of those are really good ways to look at it. What we're talking about is not just volume. We are talking about loudness. There's a big difference between those two words, volume and loudness. Volume is talking about, physically how many dBs, of level does your mix have? Like, is it hitting that sort of sweet spot of somewhere between 0 or negative 0.1 dBs and like negative 1 dBs, where it's going to be commercially at the level that most things on the radio are at? But loudness, on the other hand, that has nothing to do with volume. That has nothing to do with how many dBs it is. Loudness is what we as humans perceive it to be. We are talking about perceived loudness. I can actually be hitting that sweet spot, that mastering sweet spot that we're talking about, and my mix can still not sound very loud. But after the mastering process, it's just going to sound loud. Like if I was to play my mix and my master right next to each other, and I set them both at the same volume level, I am just going to perceive this master track as louder. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. Limiting is one of the reasons, maybe some kind of multiband compression, maybe some EQ balancing, some EQ moves. So all this being said, job number one of a mastering engineer is to make the track louder. So let's move on to job number two, and that is to enhance the tone of the track. And this is done with a few different tricks up their sleeves. That might be with some EQ balancing, that might be with some subtle excitement, using an exciter or some saturation. It might be with a stereo spreading plugin or piece of hardware, just to get it to feel a little bit wider. It might be maybe even with a little bit of reverb that they're adding just so subtly to the entire track. There's a lot of different tricks that they have up their sleeve, but ultimately they're kind of airbrushing the final product, right? They're getting your mix, which hopefully is already at a professional level, to get that true professional polish. And it's part of the reason that your mixes just never seem to sound as good as the ones you hear on Spotify that are like professionally released. That's because your mix has not been mastered yet. So there's a whole nother step of quality that you haven't gotten to. Job number three of your mastering engineer is to help your mix translate in any speaker. Now, this is a very, very common problem with honestly tons of different mixers, that you are mixing for hours and hours and hours, and you have just the most perfect scream it from the mountaintop mix that has ever been created, and you go and you play it in your car and it sounds just terrible. It just completely falls apart. Maybe you play it on your phone or in a friend's speaker system and it just sounds completely different. Well, there's a lot of reasons why that could be. That's not really something we need to be getting into this video. That's EQ balancing. It might be your low end. It might be the amount of acoustic treatment you have. It might be where your speakers are pushed. It might be how loud you're listening to it. It might be the reverb. There's a lot of stuff that could do that. But all that being said, one of the jobs of the mastering engineer is to look at your mix, see where you might have missed a few things, where there might be a few holes in the frequency spectrum, or maybe a few mounds of dirt in the frequency spectrum that, because they have the training to recognize these things, they're going to look at that and say, that area of high energy in the upper mids, this is going to keep it from sounding good in all different types of speakers. So they'll go in there and they will cut it with an EQ in a very subtle way that's going to allow your mix to sound so much better than it ever could on its own. Now, the fourth job of a mastering engineer is to keep your record consistent. Now, of course, these days singles are a lot more popular than they have been ever since like the 50s and 60s, but that doesn't mean that you're not ever going to be in a situation where you're putting out an EP or you're putting out an album. And it only takes one time trying to release an album's worth of mixes that haven't been mastered for you to finally understand, oh my gosh, this mix is so bright, and this mix is so dark, and this mix is so hollow, and this mix sounds huge, but this mix doesn't sound, it sounds, quiet and narrow. Because there is so much inconsistency in the sound and the tone of each mix, ultimately your album is going to sound really disjointed, even if each song by itself sounds great. So one of the big jobs is that these mastering engineers are listening to every single song, and they're going in and saying, okay, like I said, this one's too bright. This one's, or maybe not even too bright, just bright. This one's dark. This one is wide. This one is spacious. What can I do as the mastering engineer to subtly rebalance the tones of everything so that the songs keep their same emotional impact? They don't lose anything, but it feels like it's one piece rather than a collection of random singles or a collection of random mixes, which is really something that nobody wants. If you're trying to put out an album, you probably have a reason for putting out an album instead of putting out a bunch of singles. You probably have a story to tell. You've got a piece of art that you're wanting to put out into the world, something that might outlive you. You want to make sure that someone looks at it and sees if it's consistent. In that way, you could almost consider them a bit like an editor or like a final editor on a book. Someone who's going in and just making sure that, does the flow of every chapter make sense? Finally, there is the fifth job of the mastering engineer, and that is just to take care of the technical details of the track. That's doing stuff like dithering, converting it to MP3, lowering the sample range, adding metadata so that whenever it gets sent off to whatever streaming service you are putting it on, it's going to have the correct data encoded into it. That's making sure basically that you can actually release it and that it makes sense, that it fits with all of the current standards of all of the different streaming services or CD services, radio services, anything like that. You'd be surprised at how specific some of the technical details of an audio file need to be before they can get put on a record, for example, like a literal vinyl record. All these things that we're talking about, that is the domain of the mastering engineer. So if I was to summarize these 5 jobs, I would basically just say that, your mix is maybe an incredible photo shoot, and your master is the airbrush of the photo shoot. It's the Photoshop. It's putting the final sheen, the final polish on your masterpiece. So I want to talk to you about what you need to be taking away from this video, because obviously this video is not about teaching you how to master. There's tons of videos on that. We've got videos on this channel about that. But there's some key takeaways that are really, really important if you are trying to just create the best sounding song that you can. So takeaway number 1, mastering is essential. If you take nothing else away from this video, that is the thing to take away. You have to get your song mastered. How you get it mastered is up to you. If you want to use some of the new artificial intelligence services, if you want to use a mastering engineer, totally up to you, but you've got to get it mastered. It's not going to ever get to that professional standard that you're going for if you don't get that mastering process finished. So the second takeaway from this, mixers should not also master their track. That's a whole different ballgame. Honestly, that's a really, really common problem that I see with a lot of mixes is I'll be sent a master, I'll listen to it, and I'll ask the mixer, well, it kind of sounds overcompressed and it sounds too bright and it sounds like this, like, who mastered it? And they'll just say, oh, I did. And I'll say, okay, well, like, when did you master it? And they say, oh, I finished the mix and then I immediately put on the master. And that's an easy way for you to ruin your tracks. Partially because what mastering engineers are doing is they are adding processing that is affecting the entire mix. So even one tiny misstep could potentially ruin the sound of the entire mix. So it's very high stakes. So you want to make sure that you're using someone that has a lot of experience and knowledge that actually knows how to treat it the way it needs to be treated. But also, if you've been mixing a song for hours and hours, your ears have gotten so flat to that song. There are problems in there that you just can't hear anymore, no matter how objective you think you're being. And I'm not just talking about ear fatigue, I'm also just talking about your own subjectivity. You've now heard that one song probably hundreds of times. You're not really going to be able to hear it for the first time ever again. So you want someone else to be able to bring a set of fresh ears to that song, because they are going to be able to truly take it from pretty good to professional, because they've never dealt with it before. So the third takeaway, never master while you mix. This is another common problem I see tons of beginner and intermediate mixers do, is they think that maybe if I put my stereo spread on at the end of the mix, or maybe I'll mix through a limiter, or I'll do other stuff like this. Ultimately, if you're trying to do the job of the mastering engineer before you send it off to mastering, you're ultimately going to make your master way worse sounding. You are lowering the quality of the master by trying to do it in the mix. My biggest concern with this is mix bus processing. You see tons of people putting EQs and compressors and tape machines and saturators all on your mix bus. I do that too. I love doing that. I think it's a great way to create glue in a mix. But here's the big thing that you have to do. You have to mix through your mix bus processing. You can't add it on at the end, because at that point, you're just doing a low effort master. Save that for the mastering engineer. If you're adding it at the beginning of the mix, then you're basically just adding a little bit of glue at the very start, rather than slathering it on at the very end when the project is done. You're going to get a much more natural sound if you do it that way. Now, another takeaway from this video that's really important, don't obsess over loudness. I have been guilty of this up until, a year or two ago. I have just tried so hard to get as much loudness, that perceived loudness that we were talking about earlier, just as much as I could possibly get out of my mix. And what ended up happening is I just started to kill my dynamics. I would overcompress my mix to absolute hell. And that's not me saying that you shouldn't do some work with your dynamics to create more of a loudness potential. But ultimately, loudness, getting that perceived loudness, that's mainly the job of the mastering engineer. Leave it for the professionals. They're going to be able to handle it. And finally, my last takeaway is this, and this is my opinion. I'm just going to leave this out there. People can disagree with it. Totally okay. Last takeaway, hire a professional. You can use AI services like Lander or Aria, and honestly, even myself, I've been surprised at the quality of the sound that those services have been able to get. But here's the big thing. You're not going to be able to get that set of fresh ears that we were talking about unless you're using a mastering engineer. And also, you're not going to be able to send back any other revision requests. That's a big thing for me. Sometimes I'll get back a master and I will say, it sounds great, it's just a little too bright. Or it sounds great, but I think we limited it just a hair too much. And that's not something you're going to be able to do with artificial intelligence. But with a human mastering engineer, you're going to be able to work with them so that you are going to get the best song possible. And it might even be you going back and making some tweaks in your mix and then saying, hey, I need you to do this, this, and this. And also, I've sent you a new version of the mix with quieter vocals because the limiting was, making the vocals stand out too much, or it was pushing them back in the mix or something like that. For me, that's a really big trade-off. And that's something that I'm okay with paying more for the professional rather than using the cheaper service, which again, admittedly, better than I would have expected, but I don't really have much of a say in the final quality of. So I know that was a lot. Hopefully this was helpful for you. Honestly, this was something that plagued me so much whenever I was starting out. Kind of wished that a video like this just would have existed back then. That's why I wanted to make this video in the first place. So hopefully there are some beginners and intermediates watching this that, maybe they're not quite as afraid to move that volume fader as they were before. But here's the thing, getting a great master doesn't mean that you're gonna start with a good mix, nor does it mean that you're gonna start with good recordings. That is something that is paramount to getting a professional sound. And I'm sure you've discovered this by now. It can seem pretty complicated, but that's why Rob Mazes, the founder of Musician on a Mission, he's actually created a free workshop with his own system, the 7 steps to creating radio-ready music from home. It's a whole new approach to home recording and mixing that is going to make all of these things that you're having to learn and implement so much easier. And these steps, they haven't just worked for him. We've had thousands of people go through this workshop and they've seen results in their music in just a few days. So now it's your turn. If you want to save precious time on actually getting a professional sound with your music, and you want to do it in under a year, this is the workshop for you. It's going to keep you from maybe going down a few rabbit holes that are going to end up leading you nowhere. So click the link on screen or down in the description below, and you'll get your own personal access to this. And remember, it's completely free, and I really do think that you're going to love it. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We make videos just like this one on mixing and recording and editing and songwriting and mastering and music business, and oh man, the list goes on. We make videos just like this on this channel every single week. We would love to help you grow. Seriously, we would. So that's all for me. This has been Dylan Pines with Musician on a Mission, and remember, create regardless.